We're still waiting for an extra panelist, but I guess I will just get started. I'm Karin Stein. I'm the state organizer for Moms Clean Air Force in Iowa. And Moms Clean Air Force is an organization of over 1 million members, moms and dads. And our mission is to protect our children and other vulnerable populations from air pollution and climate change. And when we mean our vulnerable populations, we mean all of them, not just white people, people of all colors and regardless of immigration status. I'm South American and my native language is Spanish. And even though there is no time to conduct this as a bilingual program, as I would very much like to, let me just say a paragraph in Spanish so that Spanish speakers know how to get more out of the contents of this program. Soy Karin Stein, soy suramericana, soy coordinadora estatal para una organización nacional que se llama Moms Clean Air Force y su programa Ecomadres en el estado de Iowa. Este programa será en inglés, sin embargo, si ustedes necesitan obtener el contenido o entender el contenido mejor en español, me pueden localizar por este medio, por Facebook, o si no, después con la información de contacto que estaré compartiendo. All right, Santiago, if you're trying to get in, I'll get to you in just a second. 97% of the world scientists agree that 2050 is the year by which we must achieve carbon neutral economies worldwide if we want to reduce the most devastating effects of climate change and pollution. It is always, and I mean always, the most vulnerable whose lives are devastated first and foremost by anything that happens in the world, because of where they live and work, because of lack of resources, because of lack of influence, and because of fragile health. All these become compounding variables. And most of the vulnerable are disproportionately people of color. And the actions of leaders who do not help us fight against pollution and climate change, even when those leaders otherwise condemn racism, those things have racist consequences, whether they're intended or not. Earlier this month, the House Special Committee on the Climate Crisis published a thorough and quite a pragmatic report on how each state can reach the goal of carbon neutral economies by 2050. The report contains several pillars, and one of them is environmental justice, which is the focus of our conversation today. Achieving environmental justice protects people of color, it makes children safer, it helps with recovery from natural disasters, and it allows people everywhere to breathe cleaner air, which in turn increases their resilience to diseases like the current pandemic. Yet Muscatine, a city in my state, Iowa, is one of the most polluted cities in the upper Midwest. And I ask, how much longer is it okay for children there and in any other polluted areas, many of whom are Latinos, to continue breathing polluted air while our elected officials fail to speak up against the aggressive deregulatory efforts at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency? And I'm thinking especially of Senator Ernst, who has accepted major campaign contributions from oil industry, and she voted in favor of Scott Pruitt and Andrew Wheeler to head the EPA. And she says on one hand she's in favor of protecting the environment, but then adds the caveat, without the job-killing regulations. Well, those job-killing regulations have kept the vulnerable safer at a bare minimum for decades. I'm going to switch to screen sharing for a few important images. First of all, let me just mention that what you see here is what Moms Clean Air Force is all about. Please take just a minute to take in what it says, starting with the title of Justice in Every Breath. And then the words on the right are very, very important to us as well. I'll just stop here for a minute so you can take this in. Okay. I would like to introduce our various speakers. I would just like to say that I'm very honored to have them all on here today. And our first speaker is going to be Catherine García Flowers. She is my colleague in Texas, and she has the equivalent position to me with Moms Clean Air Force. And then we will switch to Joe Henry, who is president of the League of United Latin American Citizens Councils, or LULAC, at Locale 307 here in Iowa. And then we will hear from Manny Gálvez, who is owner and editor of El Trueque, Iowa, a very, very important first in print and now online publication. And he'll tell us all about some of the things that he does in Iowa. And finally, we'll hear from Mustafa Ali, whose face we hope to see before this ends. And he is Vice President of Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization with the National Wildlife Federation. All very knowledgeable individuals that I'm honored to have here. And this will be my last intervention because actually this program will be hosted by our illustrious moderator. She is a very well-regarded columnist with the Des Moines Register. Her name is Rekha Basu, and I think I'll just turn it over to you, Rekha, and you take it on. And I want to thank you very much, everybody, for being here.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Karin, and thank you all for being here, and a special thanks to our wonderful panelists, who I'm really looking forward to hearing from today. I think we're going to have a very lively conversation about a lot of important issues. So ground rules, we're going to ask each panelist to stick to 6 minutes in your introductory statements, and I will guide you with a few prompting questions. And then afterwards, we'll come back and maybe have a chance to converse with each other a little bit more. I know this time is going to go by very fast, so we'll try to be efficient with time. But we're going to start with Catherine. And Catherine, thank you so much for being here. I must say, reading your biography, how many people do we know who have directly experienced both Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Harvey? That is quite a perspective you've got there. So I think we'd love to hear from you, especially on how those two events impacted low-income and communities of color, and how, you know, resources were mobilized or not adequately mobilized in time to support them. But first, we'd like to know a little bit about your own trajectory to activism, your own background, and how you came to be doing this kind of work with Moms Clean Air Task Force. So please tell us a little bit about yourself and your involvement.
Thank you so much. And Karin, thank you again for including me on this panel. I'm always excited to get to share my perspective because, you know, I always say, what is the point of a testimony if you don't get to share it? I did lose every single thing in Katrina. I had 10 feet of water, my family lost everything. And so it was different, it was difficult. At the time, I worked for the Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana. I was his governmental and community affairs director. So I never got a chance to just be a victim. Like, I had to work, like boots on the ground the next day, realize that we were gonna have more than 100,000 New Orleanians in Houston. It's interesting how the universe works because I did evacuate. The rest of the executive team did not get a chance to evacuate. And so I did stay in Houston and was able to serve and experience service and gratitude and disaster relief like never before, firsthand. And so it was interesting. But before I go further, I just want to paint another picture for folks. Because who we are certainly cultivates how we move and, you know, just our whole transition in life. And so again, I'm Catherine García Flowers. I'm actually a first-generation American from Raton, the island of Raton in Honduras. And so I have had a very interesting life. You know, my father is an islander, but my mom is a Latino woman, a traditional Latino woman. And so I just, you know, had a different expectation because even though we didn't live on the island, I grew up in New Orleans, my mom kept us in a very small circle because English was not her first language. And so I would imagine she just didn't feel comfortable moving around. But that actually impacted me. I stopped speaking Spanish in 4th grade because they made me take English as a second language. And I'm like, but I could speak English, right? I had a huge accent, but we were judged, right? And so a part of this work, you know, we put up that mission, rebuild, renew, redress, repair, restore. Some of those injustices has happened to us just growing up, right? Contingent on what zip code you live in dictates your quality of life. So real brief, just want to tell you a quick story. So my grandmother died about 5 years ago, but I had the wonderful blessing of spending the last year of her life with her. She lived on the island of Raton and in Milton, like on the bottom of the hill. You would have to climb up the hill and down the hill to get to her. And was there almost every day, spending quality time with her. And so one day, we're in the bed, getting ready to prepare for night. And I say to her, give me one word of advice that you would want me to take to heart. One word. And she looks at me and she says, get a husband. Now I am a mother. I am a proud mother of 3 extraordinary young adults, but not only am I a mother, but I'm a leader, I'm a servant, I am an activist. But in a traditional Latino households, women weren't designed for that. Like my father, who passed away recently, really thought women were designed to serve him. And so for a lot of us, there's all this old baggage, these old value systems that really dictate how we respond. And so communities of color traditionally feel like they don't even deserve service. And that's unacceptable because we all add value to the pie, right? We all make the pie bigger. We all contribute. We all bring something to the table. And so a part of what I want to focus on is that we all have tools, but I want to help our communities put more tools in their toolkit, because such a time as this, as we've never experienced before, but now is the time for us to embrace that there are some opportunities for us to grow and do better, and change is progress. Like a lot of communities feel like, oh, we've always done it this way. Oh, my kid's school isn't failing. Oh, it's okay if my children have asthma. No, some of this stuff is man-made. And we have to fight for what belongs to us. One of the beauties of being a citizen of the US is all of these luxuries and privileges that belong to all of us. If you're here, it belongs to you. And so I'm happy to be a part of this panel. We'll say some additional stuff, but I just want to leave with injustice is racism in action. Every time our leaders fail to do at minimum what they're supposed to do, the fact that the EPA is designed to protect the environment and to make sure that we breathe clean air, but yet they are selling us out for profit. That's crazy.
So thank you for that really interesting introduction. And one thing I would ask you is, do you think that that attitude of sort of get a husband has helped to kind of repress female voices in the movement, or in any number of movements, either for Latinx rights, representation, climate change, anything? Or is the younger generation coming into its own more and feeling more confident speaking up?
So the younger generation definitely is feeling more of, because I have a daughter who just graduated from Tulane, and she's like, Mom, I'm a feminist. Like, she says I'm not a real feminist. But yes, some of that stuff that needed to fall away has fallen. And I'm not saying everything needed to change, but definitely there was some room for growth. But then you still have folks in our generation, right, that subscribe to that and still believe that a woman's place is a woman's place. Or, I mean, you can look at the folks who voted for our current administration. We really believe that a man is more valuable or their insight is more valuable. No, women add value. And so, yes.
That is fascinating. And actually, that's something that I hope that during the question and answer period, we can address a little bit deeper, is the question of Latinx people voting for the present administration. And do we think that they will do so again? Have they felt failed and let down, or have they gotten what they wanted out of it? So that's a great, very thought-provoking note to end your presentation on. And thank you so much, Catherine. I'm going to turn now to Joe Henry. And as you know, Joe is president of the League of United Latin American Citizens, Council 307 in Des Moines. And he's also the advisor to the National President for Civic Engagement and Elections. And LULAC is the nation's largest and oldest Hispanic civil rights organization. It was founded in 1929. So welcome, Joe.
Yes.
Go ahead. You recently sent some complaints to the Iowa Attorney General and to Congresswoman Cindy Axne, accusing the state of Iowa of violating the Civil Rights Act by failing to provide translations for coronavirus-related information. Talk to us about some of what you're seeing as the fallout of that failure. And also, I'm interested in knowing what you think the genesis of that failure was. But let's start with that.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for being here. So, you know, here we are. We're dealing with the pandemic, and many of the workers who have been faced with this pandemic head on have been Latino workers, immigrant workers, people of color who've been playing an essential part, but have been considered expendable during this pandemic. So with meatpacking workers, over 500,000 working at several hundred facilities across the US, and of course, many more around the world. These meatpacking facilities have been incubators for the virus. And these companies have not followed OSHA and CDC guidelines, forcing workers to work shoulder to shoulder within inches of each other. No social distancing at all, high speed of work, very little safety equipment until recently. Tens of thousands of infections have occurred that have been recorded. Many more have not been recorded, and hundreds of workers have died. And we've seen this administration turn away from these workers. We've seen no enforcement of OSHA and CDC on a state-by-state basis. Our governor in this state and other states across the country have failed to report infection rates to the CDC and OSHA. Only 22 states, not ours, have reported any type of infections occurring at these facilities. Meatpacking facilities specifically are clear examples of the incubators of the virus that have happened and have become Chernobyls for this virus in many communities in Iowa. Now we clearly in Iowa, with over 22 facilities, we are now per capita the highest rate of infections and deaths across the country. This is a terrible situation, Rekha. And there is no time near yet that this will be solved until we eliminate the racist behavior of this administration and many elected leaders on a state-by-state basis.
So thank you for that, and that's really disturbing, Joe. So to what extent was lack of translation a factor in this? Were there signs saying OSHA requires that workers keep a certain distance from each other, wear masks, don't work during these multiple shifts? Were those posted in English but not in Spanish, or were there no signs at all about safety measures to take? Were they not provided proper equipment?
Right. No signs, no pre-meetings. Over 30-some languages are spoken in many of these facilities across the country. These employers who clearly were able to recruit people from different cultures, different communities, failed to utilize translation services to alert the workers of what they face within their facilities. No pre-work meetings, no meetings during work, no posting in public places, no postings in lunchrooms or break rooms. Again, no social distancing, no 6 feet within each other, no clarity on what type of healthcare procedures would be provided as workers began to get sick. Translation services were not utilized to provide them with their rights in the workplace, and what type of resources could be provided on a federal and state level. This has been terrible. Again, treating these workers as if they're not human, making them expendable, not just essential, but expendable. It is unbelievable. So yes, these workers have been faced with no equipment and no information.
Do you have any sense of how many Latinx workers in meatpacking facilities did succumb to COVID, did get sick with COVID, and also how many died?
Well, we don't have exact statistics because many states have failed to report the death rate that have occurred. You know, we look at Iowa where a number of areas, Columbus Junction, Waterloo, Storm Lake, down in Denison, Ottumwa, and of course, close to here, Marshalltown, and also Perry, Iowa. But over 50% of the workers at these facilities are Latino and immigrant, many of which who have been infected, many of which also those who have faced, those who have died. We would estimate that most of those workers have been Latinos workers that have died.
And was it the case, as far as you know, that some of them actually went to work not knowing much about COVID at all, not knowing how it spreads or how dangerous it is? They were just trusting their employers that they would have been, you know, open and honest with them?
Yes, that is true. Starting in early March, workers were starting to get sick. They didn't know what was happening. They had heard rumors through social media. They had heard about what was happening overseas. Workers had asked their employers or human resources department what resources were available if they were to get sick, and what was happening to those who were sick that weren't returning, and then of course who had died. And it took over almost 2 months before the information really got out. It wasn't until the end of April that the death rate started to increase at these facilities across the country. And again, nothing was being provided. And then by the end of April, the president stated that these were essential workers and that these facilities must stay open, while at the same time they were closing because of the infection rates that were up into the thousands here in the Midwest at these facilities.
That is just horrifying. It's just horrifying and deplorable. Well, thank you so much for sharing that perspective and that information. It's really important for people to hear about this.
Yeah, thank you for coming on.
I'm going to move now to Manny Gálvez, and thank you for being here, Manny. Manny is a community organizer, radio host, and owner and editor of El Trueque, Iowa, a Spanish language Facebook page. And that means barter. I clarified earlier. In recent weeks, you've been very active, Manny, in providing support for people affected by the derecho storm that hit in eastern Iowa, and working with the Catholic Worker House in Iowa City to that end. So tell us a little bit about what you saw and what you were able to do to help out. What kinds of conditions were people stuck in, and what kind of help were they getting? Had it not been for you, what kind of help would they have gotten?
Yes, I think first, thank you for the invitation to Mom's Clear Air Force, because I think it's important, I mean, to have these kind of conversations. Then this is the way we can improve the situation of the communities. And before just go, I would say straight to this situation right now. As you mentioned, I've been in this part of the state but just knowing this part, but most of my time, if it's true, it's been like maybe in Iowa City, Columbo Junction, Muscatine, West Liberty. But why I mentioned these towns, because this is the rural Iowa. When this is another so important thing, that Iowa is rural. And another thing, when you talk about the immigrant community, you're going to find like more than 50% of the Latinos and Latinas in Iowa, they don't live in the Des Moines area, which means they live in the rural, the rural Iowa. And another thing, when you, this is important. All these years, I want to share something that I think is valuable and is important to mention. All these years, this is, what is happening right now is maybe just this like a pandemic situation. The derecho, they didn't do something, I would say, like a straight the community. Just these two situations, they put in the first like a place what was happening for many years with the immigrants. So what was happening right now, we are maybe talking in the media, we can watch in the newspapers and the TV stations, but many of these situations, they are for many years behind. When I was working in the Latino communities in all these towns, like I mentioned before, if you talk, I had to say, names of the towns, but when you go to like Washington County, many immigrants in the conditions like they work, they are really hard. When you drive Iowa, for example, when they mention Muscatine, I remember very well, still right now, in some part of the year, when you come like very close to Muscatine, the smell is really hard. When you drive in these towns right now, in this season, in the hot season, it's really hard to like, if you want like put your window down in your car and drive. And you know why? Because it's all the model of the agriculture like we have in Iowa. It's contamination. We are like having our environment for many years. And so when you, when I used to talk, I had this opportunity to know many Latinos and Latinas. You are going to find, we are talking about the environment, but thank you now, finally we are talking about something even, I think, more important, the human beings. Why I say this? Because if you go to these communities, people like they work in some kind of like agricultural businesses, they are exposed to chemicals. And we don't talk so much about that. Again, inside the immigrant and the Latino community. And saying that, now with this situation like we are having right now with the pandemic situation, that is right. For example, what like Joe Henry was saying right now, I hear many things that we didn't have information for months. Just not the Latinos, but also another immigrants community. For example, here in Iowa City, we needed like in French. So until like a LULAC, for example, talking about that situation, about the interpretation, that was like at least 2 months. What was happening? We need to organize ourselves in the community level. Thanks to some like a social workers, like another immigrants community in the area, we start to do ourselves. Try to translate in Spanish, try to write information in Spanish, try to make videos, try to educate the community in Spanish. Why? Because our government in Iowa, and again, this is not new, this is the most important. For me is to mention that until the problem was huge, the first 2 or 3 months of this situation in Iowa, talking about the pandemic, the Latinos and the Latinas, we represent around 7% of the population in Iowa. In some point, we represent 27% of the cases in Iowa. Just that is the level of the impact of this situation in the Latinos and Latinas, and for sure in another like immigrant groups that was the same. Having all this environment, I think like just to have some information in Spanish is not enough. We need to have policies to protect the immigrant workers. Something like we don't mention so much right now in this conversation is like the complexity of the Latino immigrants is I mean, as all the groups, it's really hard to just to say like, oh, just the Latino immigrants. No, we need to put on the table another thing is important, the legal part, which
Right.
means like, many Latinos and Latinas, they don't have access. They were isolated for many years, which means like sometimes the people, they were afraid to even like reach the, I mean, for example, the hospital, because they don't have a social security. So this is the thing like we need to like keep in mind when we talk about the Latino immigrants. And with all these, I would say with all this situation, the derecho comes to, I mean, to Cedar Rapids. And again, what's the same is when, for example, now having in mind, like, for example, Iowa Catholic Workers House in Iowa City, the Advocates for Social Justice in Cedar Rapids, community people, community organizations working to resolve a problem that we believe the government should be the first one trying to support. We were in one of the worst like situations talking about this, the derecho in the I would say like maybe the last 10, 15 years in the area, even worse maybe than when was the flood in Cedar Rapids. And the governor and the president, they spent like maybe almost 8 days to come and see and recognize that the situation was really hard. And meanwhile, the community was organizing, trying to identify who was in need, who needs support, and again, they just know the language, but also the situation about the legal status.
Right. So doesn't simply the act of seeking help from the storm alert authorities to the fact that they're there, that they live there, and make them more vulnerable, right? And what we have seen traditionally is when there is a raid on a meatpacking plant, for example, and the majority of workers are Latinx, they are the ones who get deported, but nothing happens to the owners. They don't go to jail. They're not charged with crimes. So this population is extremely vulnerable. So even, you know, having authorities alerted, having the governor alerted, and the governor doesn't want to show up because she kind of doesn't want, it's a wink and a nod. They don't want to show that they know that there are undocumented people here working and that they're vulnerable. But it's, you know, it's sort of a catch-22 that they're locked in. And so the question is there going to be more organizing around these communities who already are working such long hours, and it's very hard for them to, you know, make a living and take care of their families? What political power do they have, and what are you trying to teach them about that?
First again, another I feel like I didn't mention so much. We need to remind that Iowa has one of these these laws, anti-immigrant laws, that affect so much in these situations. Why? Because just know, just in Iowa, it's also in all the country, many times the immigrants, they feel like they are not welcome. This law, the SF4A1, that obviously all these messages from the government saying you are not welcome. So when you find these situations, it's really hard to work with the community because they are in fear. I mean, do I have to call 911 and say maybe my house was destroyed, or maybe somebody, maybe I am a citizen, but maybe my wife is not, or my son is not. Do I have to go to the hospital? I'm going to be in a problem. I think we need to create again. The government should be the first one letting us to a different future. And what we're having right now, again, in Spanish, all time when I had this opportunity to talk with the Latino community, say, it's important to speak out, to say what is happening with us. And the most important, all the Latinos and Latinas, we can vote, we need to vote. This is the only, at the end of the day, to improve the environment. I would say it's really important to close this cycle and go and vote for people represent our struggles, and it's going to be in our side, I would say. So it's going to continue working with the community. And thank you, this organization, I mentioned, that they are saying the things that they can change.
Well, and that leads us to the question of if more Latino and Latina people who our citizens vote, will they vote for the best interests of the undocumented community? Because some communities turn their backs on those who, you know, are not as entitled and haven't gone through the kind of same, I don't know, process of getting here and getting legal perhaps. But we'll come back to that in a minute after our next speaker, because I think that's a great tie-in to several of the things that we talked about. Thank you so much for that presentation. It's very eye-opening and really very, very upsetting. Our next speaker is Mustafa Santiago Ali, who is Vice President of Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization for the National Wildlife Federation. And I believe that's a relatively new position for you, Mustafa, is that correct?
Yes, about a year.
About a year. So before that, you were the Senior Vice President for the Hip Hop Caucus, a national nonprofit and nonpartisan organization, where you led the initiative on climate, environmental justice, and community revitalization. And previously you worked for 24 years at the US Environmental Protection Agency, and certainly saw it through some changes, I am sure. And also were a founding member of its Office of Environmental Justice. I would be curious to know where that office stands right now. And perhaps you can enlighten us. But you've approached these issues from so many different angles in your career. So I would ask you, what steps would you encourage for communities to get the attention of the EPA on some of these issues about emissions of methane gas, for example, that are making communities sick? Is there any hope of getting their attention under this administration? Or, you know, does one just have to write that off and take other angles?
Well, I think there's always the opportunity to get people's attention. The environmental justice movement has been doing it for decades upon decades. They've done it in a number of different ways. When the opportunity to work in collaborative partnership was there, then they've utilized that route. When they needed to grab EPA by the collar and shake them to make sure that they understood that they were serious, and also the issues that were impacting their communities, they did that. They did that by protesting, but protesting in an intelligent fashion of also bringing forward solutions and sets of opportunities to get not only the Environmental Protection Agency, but other agencies and departments as well. There are 17 federal agencies and a couple of White House offices that have a distinct responsibility for many of the issues that we've been talking about today. And of course, from an environmental justice lens through Executive Order 12898, that we're hoping will be enhanced to meet the gaps that are still going on in that process. Folks have also utilized the courts to make sure that, you know, we are moving forward in a way that is helpful and not hurtful to communities. And then it's been stated also from panelists earlier, you know, we have to utilize our vote. We have to make sure that there are individuals both in the Environmental Protection Agency, you know, in their leadership, political leadership, the other federal agencies, but also in the state houses and the county houses, and also in local governments that are standing up and are meeting the needs of what communities are asking for. And we also have to be really clear, as I was listening to the other panelists, that we have to address the systemic racism that is weaved into the fabric of our country. That does not mean that we don't love our country or appreciate our country, but that we have to address the weaknesses that exist if we want to talk about making it better and stronger. You know, there's somebody who is saying build back better, and I'm all for that. But we also got to make sure that we are truthful about how we got to this moment. So when folks are talking about, you know, the individuals who have been impacted from COVID-19, working in meat packing facilities, or folks who have been working in the fields, helping to make sure that America actually had the food that was necessary for it to continue to move on, then we need to go back to the beginning and understand that when it comes to people of color, we have never been valued in this country. We have been dehumanized so that the policies that people put in place were allowed to find fertile ground, whether it is our indigenous brothers and sisters who were removed from their traditional lands, removed from their traditional foods, and then marginalized. And some would even say there was some intentionality in blankets and other things that were given to them that had a virus on them that therefore then minimized the amount of our indigenous brothers and sisters who are still here today. Or we can look at what was done with African slaves that were brought to this country. Of course, they were stripped of their culture, stripped of their traditional foods, and given the most dangerous jobs to do. A scenario that we still see played out with folks who are coming from the islands, with folks who are Latinx, with folks who are African American, all the various folks that we're talking about today. This is a part of this paradigm that is built on systemic racism that we see continue to play out time and time again. And this also ties into the environmental justice work that happens, because if we look at where are we getting these chronic medical conditions that are making us more vulnerable to COVID-19, both on the infection rate, when we got, millions upon millions of people who are infected and 183, 184,000 people. And we all know that that is a conservative number that does not deal with the totality of the folks' lives who have been lost. So we know that in our communities, the sacrifice zones that they have created, that we find disproportionately the fossil fuel facilities that are in there, the petrochemical corporations, the waste treatment facilities, the landfills, all these things that pollute our bodies, that therefore weaken our immune systems, that give us liver and kidney disease, cancers, lung diseases, so forth and so on, that make us more vulnerable. And we know how we got into many of these communities. It was because of redlining and restrictive covenants and the zoning that when it comes to communities of color and sometimes lower wealth white communities, you are seen as less than. And when you are seen as less than, then people can do and put certain things in your community because once again, they have dehumanized you and shown that you are of lesser value because they're like, well, wait a minute, middle income and upper middle income white communities would never allow these things in their community. So where are we gonna put them? We put them in our communities of color and sometimes lower wealth white communities. And all these jobs, if you look at frontline community jobs, we know that disproportionately it is our folks who are working in the most dangerous jobs today in 2020. That is not by mistake. When they put these various things, and I should just back up and say, I've worked on policy for decades upon decades, and I've learned from all of these great folks in the civil rights movement and all of the luminaries in the environmental justice movement who said, if you really want to understand the game, there's two things you need to know. One thing you need to know is where is the money going, right? Who's getting the money? Who's getting the resources? The second thing is look at the policies. And policies can either help your community or they can devastate your community. And that's why we have to, one, be educated, but we've got to have the resources to make sure that our schools have the capacity to properly do that. And then we've got to also, as the last speaker said, we got to make sure that we're engaging in the civic process so that we can make sure that we are framing out the direction that our country has to go in. So I'm gonna slow down so I don't take up too much time, but I just wanna get to the realness of what's going on and how we got to this COVID-19 moment, this climate emergency, and the environmental injustices that continue to happen.
Well, I really want to thank you for saying what you just said about low-income communities and communities of color being more subject to these issues, because I have a very personal experience to share with this. I am from India. I was born in India, but I married an Italian-American man from the Bronx, New York. And he grew up in public housing, very low income area. And the Bronx at the time that he was growing up in the 50s and 60s was the dumping ground for every kind of toxic chemical around. And everybody knew that. I remember writing about it when I worked for Columbia University Journalism School's newspaper. I mean, it was common knowledge where the places were polluted and where polluters never did anything about it because companies got away with impunity. So my husband got ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, about 15 years ago and died from it about a year and a half later. And there was no history of it in his family. And it turns out that every single one of his close community of friends died of something similar. He had several friends who died from breast cancer, from lung cancer, who got MS, who got, I mean, you can't imagine the number of different diseases, sometimes multiple diseases in the same people. And at some point I've thought about going back to that community and just doing a study of what their systems were exposed to. It just makes me so furious to think that so many lives were lost and nobody even cared about it. And my husband, grew up to be very successful. He got out of that area. He became a journalist. He became a newspaper editor. And, we were both working as columnists for Des Moines Register when he died. But it was such a travesty, and it continues. And we're seeing this in Iowa. We're seeing this in so many different places. These hog polluting industries, they dump all kinds of nonsense into the rivers and the lakes so that people can't fish here in Iowa. The bodies of water are all contaminated, completely contaminated. The fish is contaminated. The number of fish kills that happen, and they just get away with it with a slap on the wrist. So it just infuriates me. And I guess I'd like to turn this into a note of hope and ask you all, how much of an issue do you think that climate change is going to be in November's election? And do you see communities of color and white communities coming together around this particular issue? All of you, anyone who wants to start.
Well, this is Joe. Clearly it is going to be an issue. It's going to be an issue in different forms. Within the Latino community, we have many mixed status families. We have we have adult children who are now U.S. citizens who have to face the turmoil of their parents who work at these meatpacking facilities and other industries where the COVID pandemic is happening. So they realize what's going on. They also realize that climate change is another thing that is contributing to this. And of course, meatpacking contributes to climate change due to the fact that animals are being slaughtered. The way in which livestock is utilized on farms is causing havoc with climate change. So I think clearly we're seeing it in the Latino community. And also please note that the median age of Latinos is under the age of 30. So again, many of our young people understand this and have conveyed it.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you, Catherine, because we had talked about voting earlier. Do you think that there are going to be many Latinos who are going to vote for Trump this year?
Unfortunately, we're always going to have opposing sides. And so, yes.
What is the attraction, if I may ask?
I have been trying to figure that out. Well, no. It's the perception. Perception is reality, right? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the Latino communities are very traditional. And so they are following blindly. So they have all this blind loyalty because they want to subscribe to traditions. But I think one thing that gives me hope is we have had voter apathy for many, many years now. And it's because people didn't feel like they had a reason to vote. I think between all of our experiences, because there's always something good in the bad, right? There's always a blessing in the storm.
Right.
People are seeing what they've never seen before. And so that is giving them a reason to vote. So I'm hoping that this is the largest voting turnout that we've had in the history of voting. But the prayer is for people to vote for folks who are carrying their water, who are representing their communities and not just following blindly.
Right. Thank you for that. The other question for any one of you is, to what extent do you see the two major political campaigns reaching out to Latinx voters? Are they doing much organizing or no? Yeah, Manny, you have to unmute yourself. Can you unmute? We can't hear you.
Yeah, okay. I think now.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes, because I think it's important, and I just want to tell you something in this second intervention like I have. I think all these, and I will answer your question. For example, first, all these situations on the COVID-19 and the derecho and Cedar Rapids, all these Cedar Rapids, Iowa City, especially Cedar Rapids, but with all these, I would say like almost 6 months already. I don't know about another part of the state, but here in the corridor, Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, we start to experience something so interesting, like I want to share. All these situations, I have been in Iowa for 15 years. And then I never had the opportunity to sit in the table with another immigrants. With the COVID-19, we start to talk. With the derecho, we start to talk with the African-American community. We start to talk with the working class, like a white people, like a poor people. And we start to discover that we have these same situations. So it's not just about, even like sometimes when all the things like we mentioned, it's just not about culture, why we don't go to the doctor. It's about poverty. It's a poverty in I would say in a big portion of the society. So when you mention about, like, for example, we are going to vote, we understand that no a group in America is like just like a one block. Right. In the Latino community is the same. Obviously, we understand that some Latinos and Latinas, they have more conservative values. This is understandable. But I would say that, again, talking about the Latino community, we understood that we need to organize ourselves. Why? Because it's important. Right now, for example, my candidate, like I was supporting like 2 months ago, he's not the final candidate. But after thinking, we need to understand that for Latinos and Latinas and immigrants and poor people in this country, we don't have to support a party or a candidate. We need to keep pushing an agenda that is a guarantee for everybody. Could be environment, could be like an immigrants' rights, but for us, it's personal. We need to keep organizing the community and try to encourage everybody to vote, not because the party, not because the candidate, because we need a change. No matter who is the winner. We are going to keep fighting for environment, for like a workers' rights. This is the thing like I can tell you. And I see like right now, I don't want to say like one party or the other party, they don't try to engage with the immigrant and the Latino community. Again, the Latino community. I would say the system, at least in Iowa, when you have a conversation with politicians in Iowa, always is the same. Where are the Latinos? It's so curious for me, no matter who I am talking with, always is like but where they are. You know what? West Liberty, more than 50% of the Latino population is Latino and Latina. Columbus Junction, Muscatine, Stone Lake, Marshalltown, Des Moines. It's important. Des Moines, the Latino population in Des Moines is more than maybe 6-7%, and we don't have even one person in the city council. I would say the representation of the Latinos and Latinas, we are not in the big picture. So I would say the system, just not the party, the system, they don't want to see us. In my opinion, it's really hard to say this, but I believe that for many candidates, for the parties, they assume that we are going to vote automatically for some party or for some candidate. I think the electoral campaigns, they don't work in that way.
Thank you. I see Karin has her hand up. Can you unmute yourself?
I would just like to, first of all, repeat that I'm Karin Stein. I am the Iowa State organizer for Moms Clean Air Force, which is the overall host platform for this webinar that we're having here today. And we're an organization of over 1 million moms and dads united to protect our children against pollution and climate change. And in the context of this the conversation, I'd like to say all children and all vulnerable communities, regardless of their skin color and regardless of their immigration status. And I'd like to make a comment on a few things that every speaker has made. I'd like to start with Mustafa's comment, along the lines of, look where the money is, look where the money's going. I made an opening statement as a mother, very concerned about Joni Ernst's actions. One of the things she does that I very much admire is that she works in a bipartisan way to lower drug costs. This is very, very important. But if at the same time she is not supporting regulations to protect the vulnerable, if she is taking money from oil, from big oil, if she is not speaking out about the effects of corporate agriculture on the environment and on the workers who work there, then her efforts on lowering drug costs is a half-hearted effort on behalf of sick people who are partially sick because they work under unsanitary conditions and under chronically bad conditions wherever they work and live. So it is, there is an element here of hypocrisy, and this is something that must be spoken about. I would like to address Manny's comments on the importance of voting. Voting is incredibly important, but let me tie that into my own story of hope. Let me point out, because many of you wouldn't guess this, I'm not a US citizen. I'm here as a resident. I don't vote in this country. I vote in my own country. And actually, that does not take away from me the power of speaking up. The fact that Moms Clean Air Force places trust in me to lead their efforts in the state of Iowa is a tremendous voice that a lot of people can have, regardless of their immigration status. And it's an example of how we can inspire others. I'm totally, a big part of my job is to have others see the importance. If you can vote, please do. And there's another thing that I think is very important this year. Fill out the census. The census is not a tool of the Immigration Service to put you in jail. Y quiero decir esto en español porque se me hace muy importante que todos lo sepan. I'll say it in Spanish because this is a very important message for Spanish speakers. Es muy importante que aunque usted no vote, que por favor llene el censo. El censo no es una manera de que la inmigración cause problemas para nadie. Es un recurso muy, muy importante para hacerle saber al país dónde están las personas y qué necesidades tienen. It's a tool for the country to know who lives where, a tool that down the line is going to tell the sources that give out money for schools, that give out money for clinics, that give out money for libraries, for where the needs are. And if Latinos don't, and if any immigrant, if we don't all fill out the census, then we miss out on an opportunity to give our voice. And so my hopeful piece in this is there are complex reasons why I'm not a US citizen, but that does not tie me down. You can be, because this is a worldwide issue. And let me also make a final comment about the fact that how much we have spoken about social justice in this program here today. That leads me to make the point again of how social justice is tied to environmental justice. The two are completely linked. You cannot talk about one without talking about the other. And if we want to make progress on any front, both have to be addressed, because otherwise a lot of people are not going to feel spoken to. And that is what we absolutely need. Everybody needs to be spoken to. Everybody needs to feel they have a voice and will be listened to in order to make progress. So I want to thank you on behalf of Moms Clean Air Force. I will conclude my participation, and I will leave it to Rekha and Mustafa. Rekha, you have the last word, and Mustafa maybe can make some remarks or whatever you'd like to do. But I would just like to thank you for letting me say one more thing.
Thank you so much. Very good points, Karin. Very well taken. Mustafa, the floor is yours. We haven't heard enough from you today.
No, I mean, I think all of the panelists really painted the picture of some of the challenges that we have in our country, but we also have a huge amount of opportunities. You know, I'm blessed to come from a multiracial family, and I understand that when Black and Brown come together, that there are some just incredible things that we can do, one in holding people accountable, but also in rebuilding our communities, which should be the focus, and making sure that everybody has the right to vote, making sure that everybody is honored, and addressing, you know, some of the things that we got going on. We got 24 million people who are living in food deserts in our country. We got 100,000 people who are dying prematurely from air pollution in our country. You know, we got 68 million people who are living in physician deserts in our country. So, you know, and 80 million uninsured and underinsured. So if we know that these things are challenges for everyone in our country, but disproportionately it is African-American and Latinx communities and indigenous brothers and sisters who continue to be the lowest on the rung of the ladder to success, then let's make sure that we eliminate those so that everyone can use their God-given ability to go as far as they possibly can. But let's make sure that when we talk about having a level playing field, that we are serious about that. And as folks said, the census makes sure that the resources come to our communities for us to do that. And then our vote ensures that we have people who sometimes look like us, hopefully more that look like us, who also care about us, because sometimes somebody looks like us but does not necessarily care about us, that those are the folks who are helping to work in collaboration with us to make real change happen. And as I always say, and was drilled into me from my grandmother and probably passed down from my great-grandmother, who I did not know, that we have power unless we give it away. So let's make sure that we're utilizing our power to make real change happen inside of our communities so that, you know, our country can live up to the credos that it says that it believes in. When they say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then let's make sure that everybody can actually, you know, enjoy what that's supposed to mean.
Hear, hear. Well, thank you for that. That's very inspiring. And hopefully we all take that back with us and try to inspire our own communities to play, continue to play an active role, but play an even more active role. I would come back to one thing that you said, Karin, about the ability to make change and be an activist even if you're not a citizen. I think that that's absolutely true. I was a green card holder for a long time when I first moved here from New York as a columnist. But what drove me to actually become a US citizen was a particular election where I was really afraid this one candidate was going to win a congressional seat. And I just couldn't stand telling people how to vote and not doing it myself. I also think that even though there are many things that we can do not as citizens, I think that there are different degrees of risk for people who are undocumented to be active politically, because they know if they're out there, their employers can nab them or somebody else can and send them packing. So there's a different, I mean, they have to be much more under the radar and much more undercover when they do that. But I completely agree that those of us who cannot vote, who don't have the vote, can operate in other ways.
Well, let me just say, Rekha, that it is important for people like Manny and Joe and Mustafa and Catherine and myself to continuously spread the word that we are here to speak for those who can't.
Yes, yes, exactly.
There are safe havens, there are resources, there are people who will stand up for people who are too afraid for a variety of reasons. And so, siempre hay alguien, aunque usted se sienta incómodo con la posibilidad de hablar, de levantar su voz, siempre hay alguien, siempre hay una organización, un individuo, alguien que le puede ayudar a que se amplifique su necesidad, su problema. So there is, and so that's part of what we do at Moms Clean Air Force through the Ecomadres program, is that we make sure we reach out to people who are afraid. That's part of our mission.
That is wonderful. And thank you so much for doing that. I'm really glad you said that. And, you know, to sort of bring this back around, before we went on the air live, we were having an interesting conversation with Catherine about the question of moms, you know, that it was very important to your grandmother that you had a husband, that you got married, and that, you know, everybody in the older generation said motherhood is and wifedom are your most important roles here in life. But actually, folks like you at Moms Clean Air Force are taking the concept of motherhood to a different place, which is, as a mother, we are responsible for our children's health, our children's physical health, and the toxins that they take in. And all of that forces a level of activism, if you will, to take care of bigger issues, environmental issues that are going to hound their ability to be successful and healthy adults in the future. So really thank you to your organization for doing the work that you do and putting on a program like this that we can all learn from. And, you know, more importantly, for putting a face, every one of you, every one of us, on people who are there who care about this stuff. And especially here in Iowa, I hope that people will come forward, will share their stories, for example, with me to share in my column, or will come to people like Manny and Joe and say, you know, we need help on a particular community issue and we don't know where to go or where the resources lie. And to people like the two of you, well, Mustafa, for doing the kind of work you do and providing the historical context and the understanding of having worked in a variety of different organizations with young people, especially, and hip hop generation, to get them connected to these issues. So all of this is very, very important. And it comes, I think, at a very pivotal time as we lead up to the election. You know, a lot of us don't think of elections as being that much, you know, life-changing or societal changing. And this year may be one of those, but that kind of apathy just contributes to people not voting. And this year, more than any year I can imagine in my lifetime, we really need change. We really, really need change. And we need to, and I think that we need to reach out to those campaigns that, you know, might come to us that, you know, you need to go into at the grassroots level, you need to do more organizing. You need to make it relevant to people why they should support your candidacy and what you're going to do differently. And I think, you know, when I expressed surprise that there were some Latinx people who voted for Trump, it was because I think the reason that he won ultimately was because he was dividing communities against each other and telling white people, white working class people, you don't have your job anymore. It's because the immigrants came in and took it away, you know, pointing specifically the finger at Latinos. And, you know, the same thing that he's done with African Americans, demonize them. And even in the convention, if you watch the two conventions, not a word about any of the police killings or shootings, nothing, no empathy for that community, all about law and order. The closing words of the Vice President Mike Pence, you know, to America, mark my words, you will not be safe under a Joe Biden administration, because, you know, he's encouraging this kind of violence. This kind of violence is actually people speaking up for their rights to live under corrupt police forces that know nothing but racism and are never reined in, or seldom if ever reined in. So any kind of forum like this that can bring people out to speak these truths to power is so important, and bring people together in an intersectional way, you know, to show that women's issues, race and justice and gender, and, you know, environmental issues are so closely connected. The more that we can draw those connections between white working class people who are also the victims of environmental toxins and racism, you know, and the struggles of people who are up against brutal police forces, all of that is just really, really important for us to speak up about in our own individual ways. And I'm so grateful for all of you being here and participating so fully in this forum. So thank you so much. It's been very inspiring and I've really enjoyed it.